My name is Lili Jia. I'm a senior researcher engineering department at the University of Cambridge. So my research focuses on incentivizing behavior changes towards health and sustainability.
Okay. I'm Jean Adams. I work in the Centre for Diet and Activity Research, which is part of the MRC Epidemiology Unit. And my work focuses on dietary public health. I'm interested in how we can change environments to help people eat better.
And I'm Marie Louise Stig Sørensen, and I work in the Department of Archaeology. And doing my work, I've been excavating food from thousands of years old, and also work in heritage, where we're interested in the important food as a part of identity.
Researchers in Brazil have proposed a 4-level classification of food according to its level of processing. So they start with group 1, which is unprocessed or minimally processed foods. So those are things like fruit and vegetables straight out of the field or the garden, or things where quite simple techniques have been applied. So things like drying, that would be things like lentils, or even pasteurization, so milk would fit into that group. And then they have a second group called processed culinary ingredients. So those are foods that have been transformed by processing to make them into things that we might not eat on our own but would use in a recipe. So things like butter and oils would fit into that group. And then they have the next level up, which they call processed foods. So those tend to be combinations of group 1 and group 2 foods. That might be something like cheese. So that's a mixture of pasteurized milk and it's gone through further processing and salt's been added. And then they have this fourth group of what they call ultra-processed food, which are things that have been industrially processed essentially. So very highly refined foods like biscuits that you might buy from a shop rather than have made yourself, or things that perhaps don't really have much relationship, or you can't really see the original foods that have been grown in them. So perhaps things like Pringles crisps, which are made, not even slices of potato, they're made out of reconstituted potato. So this group of researchers, their hypothesis is that it's ultra-processed food in particular that are driving the diseases that are associated with unhealthy dietary patterns, so cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancers. And I think that the evidence in favour of ultra-processed foods in particular being harmful is still not convincing. It's emerging, it's quite a new field. But what's interesting about it is that the proposal is that the general public might understand the concept of ultra-processed more than they would understand guidance to, for instance, eat more calcium or eat less saturated fat, which are kind of vague concepts that maybe only nutritionists really understand. Like, we don't eat saturated fat, right? We eat butter. And so the idea is that if we can identify foods and food groups that are less healthy, that might help people to consume healthier diets rather than if we identify particular nutrients that are unhealthy. And so Brazil have adopted this in their new dietary guidance for their citizens and encouraging people to eat pure ultra-processed foods. But for me, apart from the fact that the epidemiology is not very clear, what's interesting, I think, for me is that it doesn't seem to take into account that what we eat is not just influenced by what we know about the relationship between food and health. There's all sorts of social availability issues that influence our diets.
It also, I've thought, it sounds actually slightly complicated to understand what those categories. So if you provide an explanation to the public, which is actually quite scientific and dense, it may not be as healthy as saying you shouldn't eat so much sugar. And sugar in itself is not particularly processed.
Well, sugar from sugar cane or sugar beet, that would be considered a processed ingredient, that it is quite processed to get to those white granules from what you actually take from the field, right?
But when you come to countries like that, when people just snap off a piece of the sugar cane and go around eating it, and it's terrible unhealthy, but it's not actually processed in any way. So I think it's a little bit confusing potentially. So you say there's a question about whether it matters for health. Another thing is that it also makes some assumptions about how people encounter food.
Exactly. Yeah.
And, you know, I work in Cape Verde and they eat sugarcane all the time.
Straight from the field.
Straight from the field.
Exactly.
And it's so sweet, it's unbelievable. Yeah. And they chew it and they give it to babies and so on. It's very unhealthy.
And there's lots of sugar in what we think of as healthy foods like oranges and fruits and vegetables contain a lot of sugar. Yeah. That's interesting that the proposal is this is easier for the public to understand, and yet your response is I don't find that easy to understand.
Yeah. Did you find it an easy definition?
It's quite challenging.
I think
it's quite challenging. For example, bread. Many people buy bread from supermarkets, right? I think by that definition, bread is considered
ultra-processed.
Yeah,
exactly.
because industrialized process. And you watch a BBC program and you see how many breads they produce in one factory. Mm-hmm. But is on the other hand is about the quantity, how much they consume. So you have 2 pieces of bread in the morning as breakfast, is fine, right? Not many people consider as unhealthy choice, accompanied with a fried egg and with some salad like vegetable and fruits. It's also about how people eat with it.
Sure, it's about whole diets.
Yeah. Yes, yeah.
And that's part of this kind of movement, that trying to move away from nutrients towards foods is actually trying to encourage this thought that it's about whole diets. It's about everything you eat, not just about individual products.
But it's also very interesting, sort of the kind of value which is written into it, because it's almost as if you bake your cake, bake your biscuits yourself, then they're healthy. They're not super processed. But the things you put into home-baked biscuit might be just as harmful, or you might like to have a lot of sugar and a lot of fat and a lot of this and a lot of that. So it's, per definition, it's not necessarily much better because it's home-baked rather than factory-baked. It is the recipe which makes the difference. So my question to you is, what changes when it becomes mass-produced, industrialized? Will that have different effect? Will that introduce aspects which have impact on health?
I guess that the concern in terms of health is, the concern that people have expressed in terms of health is foods that bear little resemblance to traditional foods, so that are actually undergone a high degree of industrial processing, and that makes them tasty, palatable, can make them very shelf stable, and can really drive down the cost. So there's lots of good things about those foods, but they tend to, because to achieve all those things like palatability and stability and low cost, they tend to concentrate fats and sugars and salt, and just be very, what we call energy dense. So every bite of them involves a lot of calories, which, differentiates, for instance, a biscuit from lettuce, where a bite of lettuce doesn't have any calories really. So I think in terms of health, that's the major concern, that what industrial processing does is that it concentrates nutrients that can be harmful to health, but that we really like the taste of and want to have for other reasons.
How do you know why is it we like things which is unhealthy to us?
Well, I've heard evolutionary explanations. I'm not an evolutionary scientist, but the story I've heard is that those things like sugar and fat have a lot of energy in them. Yeah. So you can eat not very much of them and build up your energy stores. And so we are evolutionarily driven to consume those foods, because that allows us to store energy for the lean period, right? And so that's why those taste.
So it's not necessarily unhealthy to us, it just doesn't suit our lifestyle anymore.
That's right. That in that period when that would have been adaptive, we wouldn't have had great access to those foods. Yeah. So having a taste for those foods and being driven to eat them, because they wouldn't have been very available, wouldn't have been particularly unhealthy. Yeah. So, but also we would have had a lifestyle that would have allowed us to balance that out. So it's almost two things, that those foods have become much more available and easy to consume, but also, as you say, we're not as active as we used to be.
It's quite interesting because things like access to sugar, and in that sense the slave trade was enormously important in terms of, in terrible way. But until then, we actually have very few sources of sweet. We have honey and we have berries.
Sure.
And then it was only, is it in the 19th century that they started using sugar beet?
I don't know when sugar beet
It's
started.
quite late.
So
I remember it was around Napoleonic War, that because it was some trade blockade. But that we actually, the amount of sugar we have and the sources of sugar we have in our diet is not a very short time behind it.
Well, fruit has a lot of sweetness in it, so.
Yeah. But also fruit, if you think a country like England, they would have apple, pears and cherries and some plums. Yeah. That would be all.
What about trade and things like oranges from Spain? Like, oranges are quite stable.
But that is, then you get into medieval period. If you think about our history, there we have actually not had that much sugar in our diet until relatively recent. We've had a lot of fat.
Yeah. But we like that taste, whether or not we've had lots of
interesting.
To it. Yeah. And it is interesting that it's driven huge geopolitical events. Yeah. We were talking about sourdough bread earlier, but that's part of a whole movement of a particular middle class group towards moving entirely away from processed food that one would buy from a shop and producing it all yourself, so that it goes with, I'll have an allotment and I make my own yogurt and I knit my own shreddies. And it's almost a caricature, of the people who do all that. But you can only do that if you have a lot of time. The ingredients are often quite expensive. And so that it's almost that processed food has become so ubiquitous that people are buying themselves out of that as well to identify something different.
Yes, that you don't gain social prestige by serving tinned tomato soup.
Exactly, yeah. Or you don't in some social groups, yes.
And that in some way, in terms of poor health, it means that the poor sectors of society who do not do prestige cooking and prestige food, they're the ones who easily end up eating the unhealthy part.
Because it's cheap.
Because it's cheap. And it's the way they think about food.
And that's a funny cycle, right? That processed food, part of what's attractive about it is that it's affordable.
Yeah. And
it freed up people's time to spend on other things. And that was great. And now we've kind of come round to this cycle of it's so affordable that lots of people don't want to be associated with it. And in fact, they'd like to devote their time to spending a lot of time on producing home-prepared food.
Yeah, it seems like processed food is a source of many unhealthy diets problem. And I'm wondering it could also be the solution to the problem, because unhealthy diets intend to consume this type of food more. And if they change the way they produce food and they change ingredients, reduce salt, reduce sugar, and reduce fat, and which means like all their consumers who are currently consuming this type of food can directly benefit.
So in some way that returns us back to the definition that it's not necessarily because it's processed that it's unhealthy. It's what is being processed, what is coming put together there, and that could change.
So I feel that that's a real problem with the definition. That is it the processing, that process that makes the food unhealthy, or is it just that processed food tends to contain sugar, fat, salt, as you said, and that we can change that? And we tend to focus a lot on fresh fruit and vegetables. So the 5-a-day message is about fruit and vegetables, and it actually doesn't mention fresh, but there is a kind of that word fresh goes with fruit and vegetables, but tinned fruit and vegetables or frozen are probably just as good for you as long as they're not tinned in syrup or tinned in salt water. But those simple ways of preserving food, I think, are probably a very good way to get around the problem of storage.
And what about things like tuna, tin of tuna and so on? If it's in salt water or brine or whatever, it is as healthy as if it was lime coated?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. So for instance, tinned vegetables lose some of their nutrients, but I expect that they're better for you than no vegetables, right?
Actually, the critical thing is also what the tin is made of, because the early tin, some of them had lead in them, and then it was certainly not beneficial to your health. So and that's of course another aspect of tin food and processed food, is all the material which come around it.
Yes. And that has both impacts on the environment as well as people's health, right? And produces waste that we have to get rid of.
Whether the processed food can be healthier and healthier.
Sure.
So take a bacon as an example, because many people just love bacon, right? It's difficult to give up. And we are talking about the identity, social identity. It could be part of the identity for some people. And so for bacon, and most of the bacons, they have high salt. That's a big issue. But
that's what makes it so tasty.
Technically, it's possible to have 1/3 or even less salt. It's still tasty. I tried it. So if if industries can popularize this type of technology and make this type of bacon, healthier bacon, we call it, more accessible, and people who enjoy bacon can easily have less salt in their daily diet, right?
So, and that's exactly what the UK government strategy on diet is focused around at the moment, is a kind of a gradual process of reformulation, and that started with something called the Salt Reduction Programme, where
that's quite,
the producers of salty food were all got together and were supported by government to very gradually reduce the salt content so that people didn't notice, their palates adjusted, and yet by the end of 10 years we were all consuming less salt. And the hope at the moment is that we can replicate that with a sugar reduction programme. So both reformulate, just gradually remove a little bit of sugar so people don't notice, but also try and reduce portion sizes a little bit as well, so people are consuming just a little bit less. And that's happened. For instance, the Coca-Cola has introduced new thin cans of Coke. They're slightly smaller than the old cans, so you're consuming just a little bit less.